Those of you taller or shorter may be seated now. Good morning, boys and girls.
Good morning, Father Don.
There's a few of you boys amongst all of you girls. I got a question for you this morning. Who in your life is a leader? Who's a leader in your life? Your dad. Ooh, I like that. That's really good. Who's a leader in your life? Your coach at your school, is that what you said? Yeah, perfect. Aoife, you're a leader in your life? It's the truth. I should just accept it. I certainly am not on that level. Yeah, yes, Emma. Your soccer coach is your leader? Who else? Olivia, your sister, is your leader? Okay, that's pretty good. Your cat is your leader? All right, well, cats like to be leaders, that's for sure. That's for sure. What do leaders do? What makes somebody a leader? What do? They guide you, right? They help you through rough times. Aoife? Yeah, they're an example. Can they tell you what to do? Sometimes do they have some power, right? These are all good things as well. Sometimes we need somebody to have a little power and tell us what to do. Well, today, I don't know if you heard that gospel reading, but there are two of Jesus' disciples, James and John. They're always getting in trouble. And they catch Jesus walking, and they use a name for Jesus that's another one of our leaders. Did you guys hear what they called Jesus? They called him something you have at school. Teacher. Are teachers leaders for y'all? Whether you like it or not, whether you like it or not, they are. So they call Jesus teacher, and they say, hey, Jesus, this is a big thing to ask Jesus. You guys know who Jesus is, right? Well, they run up and they say to Jesus, hey, we want you to do exactly what we ask you. And Jesus says, all right, what do you want? And they say, make us the two that will sit on your right hand and your left hand when you come into glory. That's kind of fancy for us to understand. But if you were right up there, who gets to sit at the head of the table at your house? Your mom, maybe? Grandfather, grandmother? Somebody kind of important gets to sit up there, if you still do it that way. And perhaps I've just revealed my own age and issues by saying it that way. But there was a time when my grandfather was the only one allowed to sit at the head of the table, and my grandmother got to sit at his right hand. And this was a sign of how important these people were. So that's what James and John want to be. They want to be important. They want to be leaders. They want to have a little bit of power. And you know what the other 10 disciples do when they hear James and John asking that question? They get a little agitated. If you were in your classroom and somebody wanted to be the right hand of the teacher, what would you think about that? Would you be okay with that? Probably not, right? I mean, if you like that person, you might. But what if you wanted to be the right hand? So this is what the disciples are arguing about. But Jesus gives them a different understanding of what a leader is. And you know what's good about it? I think most of you get this by who you said was your leader. Jesus says that those who want to be great must be servants. So anybody who wants to be the first has got to be the one who helps everybody that is with them. And really, in some ways, above and below them. That's what a Jesus leader is all about, is helping someone. So when you name your dad as being your favorite leader, does he help you? Does he do things for you? Does he tell you to do some stuff too? But that's okay, right? And when you talk about your coach, who is your leader, is he kind of tough sometimes on you, or she? I don't know which coach you have for your soccer team. What's that? He's nice to you, but he's there to help you learn how to do something, right? So is your teacher serving you? Well, that's what they're supposed to be doing, is helping you and serving you. That's what they're there to do, and that's what Jesus wants us to do, is be servants. If you want to be great, you have to serve others and help other people. Sometimes your sister, right? And sometimes your classmates, and sometimes those on your soccer team or somewhere else. That's what being a leader is, a servant leader. Now, I want you to look out at all these people here. Look at them. See them all out there? Do they look happy to you? They look pretty happy today, but you know what happened yesterday? Nobody in the state of Alabama was happy yesterday? On either side of the state, were they happy? They looked really sad and disappointed. And you know what they need? They need to be reminded that somebody loves them no matter what happens on Saturday, whether it's good or bad, whether you get to be like all these people or whether you get to be like Deacon Jeannie, who was thrilled yesterday in that game against Alabama. I want you to look out at all these people on the count of three. Tell them who it is that loves them. Are you ready? On the count of three. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. You may think this sermon has something to do with yesterday as well. It does not. I'll tell you that right now. Good morning. Brothers and sisters, for the past 3 weeks, we have been moving through what is perhaps, as Mother Katie told the children last Sunday, the oldest book in the entire Bible, the story in the book of Job. 2 weeks ago, we got started on this tough text in which righteous Job, the greatest, most upright and blameless man of all the East, suddenly found everything he had, his property, his servants, his sons and daughters, all destroyed, stolen, and ripped away from him. And as we all know, all of this appears to have happened in the book simply out of a wager that was made between Satan, the adversary, and God, the Creator. It is the very start of what we as human beings have been stressing over, wondering about, and crying out to God to explain to us since the very beginning of time. Why do terrible things seem to happen to good, righteous, and innocent people? Of course, we know that the story of Job doesn't end with just the loss of his property and his beloved children. In fact, the reading from Job we heard 2 weeks ago that kicked off our walk through the land of Uz in the Hebrew Bible was about the second wave of the attack by Satan on Job, this time going after his very body, inflicting Job, as the Bible says, with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. After this affliction, the writer of Job tells us that Job had to take a piece of broken pottery to scratch his body while he returned and laid amongst the ashes of mourning for the loss of his children. Moving through the book of Job over these past 3 weeks has put me in mind of what was perhaps one of the most important, impactful books I read in seminary 100 years ago. The book is entitled On Death and Dying, and it was first published back in 1969 by a Swiss-American psychiatrist some of you may have heard of before, named Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. I'll never forget the first time I poured through that book in one of my pastoral theology classes. I had to read a lot of books. I don't remember all of them. This one I remember. And I remember it because for a guy just entering into his 30s back then, it was on a subject that I was only beginning to realize was about to become one of the most serious and important parts of my life and vocation as a parish priest. Today, Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying remains close to me on my bookshelf at all times, just down the hall in the church office. And it's there for no other reason most of the time than just to keep me in mind of what I learned from it so I can use it again. And I've read many of the other books Kubler-Ross wrote about dealing with death, dying, loss, and grief over the last few years as well. In her book, Kubler-Ross gives us what has now become known as the 5 stages of grief for those who have either received a terminal diagnosis or for those who have lost a dearly beloved friend or family member. Kubler-Ross would be the first to tell us that the 5 stages don't always flow in the order that she lays out. I've certainly encountered people who skip through the different stages myself, sometimes in their life over the course of quite a few years. But what I find to be the most helpful is that there's no question that these 5 stages of grief come under the description that Kubler-Ross put together so well in her book all those years ago. The 5 stages of grief are: first, denial, which can come from the very shock that almost always accompanies our first notice that we've lost someone close to us, or that we ourselves have a set timeline until our own ending. Stage 2 is the attempt to bargain, bargaining for more time, bargaining for a way out, bargaining for a way to restore what's been lost. Stage 3 is anger. Anger that this has even happened. Anger that we are unprepared. Anger that we are not ready. Stage 4 comes when the anger and the bargaining go away, and depression and sadness come over us for what we now know is unreversible. And stage 5 suddenly appears when we finally accept where we are, what is happening, and how we must find a way to move forward. As I said, the stages don't always come in that numerical order, but I've found from what I have encountered as a priest and as someone who's lost someone I've loved deeply myself, that we as human beings do move through our own stages of grief that are very close to what I first learned when I read On Death and Dying by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross around 20 years ago. Of course, what's even more amazing about the story of Job in the Old Testament, possibly written in the 7th century before Jesus, over 2,700 years ago, is that it also seems to be following the very same 5 stages of grief and loss we now can observe in ourselves and those who we love when they move through their pain and grief, just as Job is doing in the Old Testament. Certainly in our first reading 2 weeks ago, in the midst of losing everything except his very life and entering into an experience of physical and emotional calamity with his clothes torn and his body marked with sores, we find a man in utter shock. It is perhaps only when he arrives at a revelation that if we accept God with us in the good times, we must also accept God with us in the evil times, that Job seems to move out of the shock and the denial and into a kind of bargaining with God. The passage of chapter 2 we read just a few weeks back ended with a very interesting turn of phrase. It said, "In all this, Job did not sin with his lips." My question is, if he controlled his speech, what might have been going on in his head? Was he perhaps beginning to try to bargain with God himself as he sat in pain and sorrow and meditated on what it exactly means to have God with you in terrible times as to have God with you in good times? Whatever happened in his mind, there's no question that after enduring the hard words of both his wife and his 3 friends, by the time we arrived last week at the readings that were assigned, Job was certainly in the 3rd stage of grief, which is that stage of anger. As Mother Katie made reference to last week, in the reading from Job we had then, he is now ready to not curse God, but to stand up and ask for some answers. To ask God why, if he had given so much to Job, why God then made the decision to take all of it away so swiftly and without warning. In chapter 23, Job declares, "Today again my complaint is bitter. My strength is spent on account of my groaning. What that I knew how to reach him, how to get to his dwelling place. I would set out my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what answers he had for me and know how he would reply to me. Would he contend with me overbearingly? Surely he would not accuse me. There the upright would be cleared by him, and I would escape forever from my judge." And all of this must have been going on surrounded by that 4th stage of grief, which is total sadness and depression. The writings of the book of Job give us little to describe Job's sadness. But from the moment he tore open his robe, shaved his head, and fell on his face in the dirt in the very first chapter, Job was a man in complete and total despair. And again, what amazes me is just how completely pertinent and applicable to the pain and loss all of us can find ourselves facing at any moment in our lives today. This ancient story of the Bible remains. Haven't we all been shocked and fallen on our faces in despair before in one way or another, especially at the loss of someone dear to us? Haven't we all wanted to make a bargain to somehow reverse it? Haven't we all gotten angry and wanted to scream at God? I know I have. And there's no need to ask whether or not we've all been through our own times of never-ending sadness. Where is it that we can ever find the way to pull ourselves up out of the ashes of mourning? How can we ever make it to that final stage of acceptance? What does it take? Well, this morning, brothers and sisters, we arrive at God's answer to that question. For Job, and really for all of us, God's response to Job's shock, Job's bargaining, Job's anger, Job's sadness isn't going to be a simple way to find relief. Not easy to find release, but without question, I think, something we can all wrap our heads around. God says to Job this morning, "Who are you to throw accusations at me when you do not have the incredible view of all of creation and purpose and fulfillment that I have?" God says this in the book of Job. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy?" I don't know about you, but I would not want to have God shake down like Job has this morning. Of course, there is a purpose for this statement of God to Job, beyond being just reprimand. And friends, I believe that statement continues to hold true down across the centuries to all of us today. No matter what kind of predicament we find ourselves in, no matter what pain or fear or loss seems to sneak into our lives and shake us to the core, are we all not just ourselves tiny little specks of dust in the vast entirety of God's great providence and God's purpose? And in the midst of our own distress, how are we to know what God's hand is actually working to bring about in our own lives and in the greater working of God's plan for our lives, our families, and our creation? The hardest thing to do then is to find a way to say that and to trust God in the midst of it. To stand in the face of darkness and to somehow know that God is still with us, that God's purpose is moving and working and shaping everything, whether we want to be in the midst of it or not. That as Jesus will say to us and again, we have nothing to be afraid of because Jesus is there. Jesus is walking beside us and perhaps even carrying us as we walk into the fog. And that's God's answer, I believe, to the question, why do bad things happen to good people? God's answer is, trust me. And how are we to find our way to that final stage of trust and acceptance? Well, because we already know and believe that God's workings are for love. We know God's plan is for good. We know God is working to set creation right again as it was in the beginning when God created you and me in God's very own image, when God set us in a garden that was glorious and beautiful, and when God said that it's all created to be good. We also know that even in the hardest, most frightening times, that we can trust God completely because God has come to us and lived among us in the person of Jesus. And not only did God live and walk and teach us in Jesus, but God also suffered in every way that you and I can suffer. God grieved as we grieve. Jesus went through those 5 same stages of loss that Job did 2,700 years ago, and just as me and you have already or will go through ourselves one day. And Jesus even allowed himself to touch and experience fully the pain of what frightens us the most, which is death. The same death our loved ones before us have already passed through, and the same death you and me must pass through ourselves one day. Jesus did it to show us what Job had not yet been able to see, that God's love is so deep and so amazing that God will go anywhere you and me have to go, into whatever sadness and pain and loss we must pass, and God will do it to save us from that loss and pain. And not just you and me, but to save God's fallen world. As the writer of the letter to the Hebrews proclaims to us this morning, we can trust and believe and fully accept whatever this life and this world throws at us, because in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Even Jesus himself lays it before us in the Gospel of Mark this morning when he says to his bickering disciples, fighting to climb up some useless ladder of earthly power and success, "Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be a slave to all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." I don't think I've got an answer for why we have to face sadness and trauma. But brothers and sisters, I can tell you what can and will get you through it. Trust God, the God who loves you. Trust in Jesus Christ, the God who saves you. That gets me through. And for that, I say often, thanks be to God.